Our guest today is someone whose face and name you may not know, but whose images are powerfully resonant and have won in many prestigious awards and grants around the world. But I think that perhaps his greatest achievement is actually just in still being alive, given where he puts himself, which is in the way of war, conflict, disaster, and danger. Stephen Dupont comes back to Scarborough as a sanctuary from assignments that have taken him to some of the most violent and war-torn corners of the planet, as well as to places ravaged by humanitarian crises. Stephen, it's really nice to meet you at last.
It's great to meet you too, Caroline. Thanks for having me on.
Pleasure. Now, I want to know, you grew up, I think, in Western Sydney and also spent time growing up in the Southern Highlands. So how have you fetched up here? How long have you lived here? We need to know your credentials.
Okay. Well, it's kind of been a bit of a cycle, really. I mean, when I think back to my childhood, my early childhood was in Mittagong. My mum and dad were social workers. I don't know for those who know much about Mittagong, but it's one of the major centres of both juvenile delinquent, or was when I was young, juvenile delinquent and other reform schools and homes for orphan children, basically. And my parents ran many of these homes, and we lived in the homes with all the kids. So it was an interesting upbringing. I learnt to surf at Macaulay's and Bulli and Coaldale, and I would go surfing after school. In high school, I would drive from Campbelltown, which was like a 40-minute drive, through Appin, or sometimes we'd cut through Wedderburn and down. And my friends and I from school, we'd basically spend the afternoon surfing. My biology teacher introduced me to surfing, and so I had a connection to the Illawarra. I had a connection to this part of the world, but it took me another, 40 years to come back again, and a lifetime.
Wow.
So there is that connection from my childhood.
So your parents were social workers, and you grew up with these children that were not were disadvantaged, and took them in, and obviously, so you had a kind of heightened compassion. But I'm wondering, at what point did the idea of photography as a possibility occur to you?
Well, in fact, I didn't really know I was going to be a photographer until I left high school and went traveling around the world when I was 18. I did have a camera, a film camera, of course, because that's what we shot back then, and I'm still a lover of film, I have to say. And I was working at Kentucky Fried Chicken, embarrassingly, from about 15, so I could earn my own money to buy a camera. And I bought an old Pentax K1000 from one of the guys that worked at KFC with me, actually. I still remember his name. His name was Claudio. He sold me this camera, and it was an incredible camera, and I loved taking pictures with it. So from about 15, I was kind of mucking around and photographing different things. So I had an interest in photography, but I was more connected to music. I was more my dream was to be at one point I wanted to be a sound engineer. Because I didn't play an instrument, but I love music, and I love the idea of mixing music. But my great love was film and filmmaking. And in fact, from a young person right through my teens, I was really interested in horror films. I was interested in the genre of horror. A friend of mine wrote an article about me and sort of said something in the way that, I grew up on horror films, but decided that, why make fictional horror films when the whole world's a horror film? Why not go out and document it?
Exactly. So you graduated from the photography school of Kentucky Fried Chicken, and then your apprenticeship watching genre movies.
Yeah, I faced the world, and the world was a horror film, a real horror film, and it really was, and it really is still in many ways. I suppose my upbringing, with my parents being social workers and looking after these these kids, these orphan kids and juvenile kids, I think gave me a real sense of what it must be like to be in that world. And I was always privileged because I was not one of those kids. I had my mum and dad, but I was an outsider looking in, really. But when I went out into the world and started to see the world for what it was, I think it really hit home that I kind of had a sort of a closer and greater understanding of what these kids must have went through in a sense. And I felt kind of connected to that world as well. I felt connected to the suffering and the marginalized.
Yeah. And does that mean then, Stephen, that, as you said, the world was a horror film and still is, that when you see something happening on the news, like the explosion in Beirut, do you have an almost kind of visceral desire to go there? Do you think I should be there?
Yeah, of course. Yes, always. Yes, there's a constant desire to go and cover such a story, and for me personally, it's not so much the explosion or the carnage. For me, it's that I've never been to Beirut. I would love to go to Beirut. I would love to go to Lebanon. It's a place that I've wanted to go to. So, photography is obviously a big part of my life, but photography is one thing, but it is the life. It's the life that you go and experience. It's the food that you eat. It's the smells. It's the people that you meet, the conversations that you have. That's what drives me to go and travel and to go to these places. It's to look beyond. I mean, photography is my way in. It's my prism. It's what I see and what I want to document and what I want to bring back and show people. But personally, for me, it's not the main agenda. It's really about experiencing what's going on and meeting people. That for me is really important.
We were looking at a picture of a shattered piece of glass with a man who looked possibly like a Pashtun fighter. I think we were in Afghanistan.
Yeah, you are in Afghanistan, but that photograph was of the former leader of the Northern Alliance called Ahmad Shah Massoud.
Yes.
And Massoud was assassinated on September 9, 2001. So 2 days before September 11 and the World Trade Center. In fact, that led up to that. And so if you go back in time and look at those events, I think all of us will know that day, and the whole world knows that day of September 11. But not many people know about 2 days earlier that the leader of the one faction that were fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan, Ahmad Shah Massoud, was assassinated by Al-Qaeda insurgents that were posing as journalists from Iran. They were suicide bombers, and they killed him and themselves. And in effect, that kind of sent a bit of a kind of a domino effect in a way. With the dismantling of his forces, the Taliban believed that they were going to take the rest of the country and take over Afghanistan, but the war on terror began, and the Americans and the international community stepped in and started the big war as we know, and it's still going on today.
Can you tell us about this picture?
Well, this is an Afghan refugee lady in a refugee camp in Pakistan. I took this in January of 2001, and it was just of a lady, an Afghan refugee woman walking with her back to me. So she's walking away, and I loved the effect of the burqa and how it was blowing in the wind. And in fact, this is one of my personal favorite photographs. I mean, this for me kind of conjures up lots of memories and lots of impressions of a positive side to the war. And on my contact sheet, the frame that I took before that frame, her husband is with her. And it's an incredible photograph of, a juxtaposition of that one, because he's staring at me. You don't have it, unfortunately, but he's staring at me with his fists clenched, and he's giving me the most evil, most hatred look that someone could give. Obviously, her partner was not happy, but I don't believe it was so much the photograph as it was me personally. And photographing, just being there, like just the kind of hatred toward a Western white man. I took her front on with him walking toward me, and then I took her walking away. I mean, it was done very quickly and respectfully, in that I didn't interfere with anything. I mean, it's as a street photographer, you work very quickly.
We've got another picture of yours up at the moment, which shows a man in profile, and I'm guessing that we're at Bamiyan, are we?
We are. This is where the great Buddhas of Bamiyan used to be, until the Taliban blew them up in 1996, much to the world's disgust. I don't know if you remember that.
Very much so.
So, this is considered one of the greatest archaeological atrocities that we've ever seen. And what happened, these were the great Buddhas. There's two of them. This is the grand one, and then a little to the right that you don't see in the frame is the other slightly smaller one. But they were the largest standing Buddhas in the world. That dated back, I think, 2,000 years or so. And the Taliban had firing practice with rocket-propelled grenades and tank fire to destroy them, as they were destroying a lot of culture that was not of the Islamic faith at that time. I remember when it happened, and I was. It's funny where something that's not human can almost bring you to tears. I mean, when you think of the history and how long they've stood through Alexander the Great, there's sort of, and copious amounts of wars, and you have a ramshackle bunch of, sort of ultra extremist Islamist Taliban boys that destroy it. It's crazy.
What do you think in today's world the power of black and white is? Because it seems to confer kind of instant classic status to me. When I see a picture in black and white, I do look at it differently. Yeah,
well, I think because we all see in colour. It's a kind of a cliche. We see in colour, so black and white is something much more, there's a certain mood and feeling, I think, that you get when you look at a black and white photograph. It certainly opens up your mind and your senses to looking deep inside the image, maybe much deeper than you might with a color photograph. It certainly changes the way you see things, because we don't see in black and white. I've been drawn to black and white because my favorite photographers shot in black and white. And so from a young age, I was naturally drawn to the black and white aesthetic and image. And it's only in later times that I started to appreciate color.
Are you talking about Robert Capa? Are you talking about Don McCullum?
Sure, yeah. I mean, well, Don McCullum was the single most greatest influence on me personally. I mean, I blame him for putting me on this path. I blame him for me being a photographer. In fact, I told him face to face at a restaurant in Paris once when we had dinner together, and happily, in a nice way, abused him for introducing me to his world, which had a really big effect on me.
I tell you that I had the great privilege of interviewing Don McCullin many, many years ago.
Oh, really?
That he was a very troubled man, a very haunted and troubled man. Later in life, long after his extraordinary career taking pictures that we'll all remember forever from places like Vietnam, he kind of sought beauty out, and he took a lot of pictures of flowers,
Mm,
roses in England, in his garden.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, do you take a certain group of pictures as a kind of antidote, like Don did, to sort of cleanse your mind of the horror that you've witnessed?
Not in that way, no. Look, I think the difference between, I think Don McCullen was a lot more deeply affected by the trauma that he witnessed than I think I have. I think he saw a lot more than I have. I think that for a while, he saw through the Vietnam War, he saw through the Lebanon War and
Ireland,
and Northern Ireland, and he was, he was working at a time where he just didn't stop.
No.
And I've always balanced from day one. I've never classified myself as a war photographer. I've really, I'm interested in that side of history and that side of that world to photograph and to document. But I'm also interested in the beauty. I've always been interested in the beauty. I've always balanced my world. So, I could be in Afghanistan and then I could be in Paris photographing the collections, or I could be in London doing a portrait shoot, or back in Australia doing some sort of, piece on a road trip.
This picture, by the way, that we're looking at the moment, we seem to be looking at a guru or a sadhu from India.
Yeah, it's a project I did in 2010 where I photographed sadhus with a white sheet that I pinched from my hotel room and sort of dragged it around. It's in Haridwar, up on the Ganges, and it's a portrait series I made with this white sheet, and it kind of started an ongoing obsession with the white sheet. In fact, this was the first story that I did with this white sheet, and then since that time, I've gone on to do many others with the same white sheet. And this is out of a diary. This is out of my original diary that I carried in the field. And then I started to collect Indian fabric stamps to decorate. And in fact, it's research as well, so it kind of allows me that research to then go on and make books and exhibitions and things. So carrying diaries and working with diaries in the field is always a big.
We're looking at a picture now, which might be a picture from PNG, and you've talked about PNG as your true and fearsome friend. What does that mean?
Yeah, true and fearsome friend. Well, if I fell in love with the place the first time I sort of stepped off the plane almost into Port Moresby. I just had a real connection to it, and I think that it's become closer and closer each time I go back. But fearsome in a way that it's not the safest place to be, and you do walk around with a sense of, there is danger there, and there's real present danger that you need to be aware of.
Can we just think about
there's incredible people that that make me laugh, and they're honest and raw, and they have a real connection, particularly to Australia.
Can I just go back to present danger? You've been injured in Kashmir, I think in a conflict, and you've been attacked in Bucharest, and you've been in plenty of places where you had no business in being, and where there was no guarantee that your status as a press photographer would cover you with any degree of safety. So can you just give us one example, perhaps, of when you've been genuinely afraid and you've thought, shit, my luck's just run out?
In 2008, I was blown up. I was in a suicide bombing in Afghanistan where 30-odd policemen that I was travelling with were killed, and I was slightly wounded, and my colleague was badly wounded, a journalist, writer friend of mine. That was, without doubt, the closest I've come to experiencing what we would see as death, but because it's so quick and you're still alive, and in my case, I was relatively unscathed physically. Mentally is another thing, but the question's very interesting that you asked, because in 2000, no, when was it? In 90, I think it was 96. Yeah, 1996. I got to backtrack a couple of years. I covered the genocide in Rwanda. So I was one of the first photographers actually on the ground soon after it all kind of blew out in the media that there'd been some massacres on a road, and it was starting to look like the country was unraveling. And I was based in London. I was living in London, and most of the world's media were in South Africa covering the elections, the first democratic elections. I wasn't there, and when Rwanda kind of started to blow up, I went straight out there to cover that story, and it ended up being one of the big atrocities of our time, the genocide. And 2 years later, I went back because the Hutu refugees that had fled Rwanda into neighboring Zaire were coming home. And so there was a massive refugee exodus returning home. And I went into Zaire from Rwanda to cover this story. And I was traveling with a CNN couple working for CNN. Anyway, we ended up in a place that we probably shouldn't have been, and we got heavily shot at, and to the point where we had to run and hide in this kind of long savanna-like kind of grass, and the shooting went on for 10 or 15 minutes, and when you're pinned to the ground and the bullets are flying over and cutting the grass above your head, you have time to think. You have time to really look at your life and to start thinking, I'm not sure I'm going to get through this. And that was a time that I thought that was the one time that, because I had the time, and there was so much gunfire and the soldiers kept coming closer and closer, where they were literally going to walk over the top of us. So we were all trying to have this sort of like a kind of a group discussion. Should we stand up and surrender, or should we run? Because there was a forest nearby, and we certainly thought that we might all just want to run for it, but we decided that if we ran, we probably wouldn't have survived and they would just kill us. So let's face them and try and get out of this with our fixers, explaining to them who we were. And luckily it worked. I mean, it was a tense situation. We were marched on the road with guns pointed at us, with our fixers pleading to the soldiers to let us go. Somehow something was said, and eventually, after all this kind of tension of not only being shot at, but then kind of marched up on the road thinking you're going to get a bullet in the back of your head, they let us go. I mean, it was an extraordinary situation that I would never want to live through again, but it was also life enriching, if that is a kind of maybe a strange thing to say, but I think when you're faced with something like that, I think it changes you as a human being. I think it really does, and I think it changed me in a really good way, I hope.
I wanted to ask you about the project that you're working on now, because it involves another local, and that's actor David Field. What are you cooking up together?
David and I are not only very close friends, but we've worked together quite a bit over the years, and we've been working on it's an environmental series. So it's looking at our climate crisis in Australia, I suppose globally as well. We work with a wonderful man by the name of Dr. Reese Halter, who's an earth scientist. And essentially Reese, David and I have been travelling around Australia and looking at our ancient forests and looking at how the impacts of deforestation and other climate change related issues are affecting the forests.
So, Stephen, this last picture that we're looking at now, it looks kind of apocalyptic. It looks like it could be a picture that has a kind of environmental message, or it could be something entirely different. Just tell me what this rather ambiguous picture is of.
It's Afghanistan in 2005. It's a helicopter that's landing behind them, kicking up the desert dust, and they've got jerry cans. So it's actually bringing in fuel.
It's both very concrete and very real and slightly abstract at the same time.
I think that says a lot about my photography. I mean, I kind of see things, I suppose, in a sort of an abstract way as well, in terms of what I personally like and how to photograph things.
I know you also studied philosophy, and I think that and the history of you growing up, as you say, with your parents as social workers, and the kind of compassion that you must have developed at home must really feed into your work. I can't resist one more image. We're going to finish on this one. We have to show this picture because it is so amazing. This is called Sing Sing Triptych. Can you just talk us through this?
Yeah. Well, this is it's from the Sing Sing festival in Mount Hagen in Papua New Guinea. It was my first trip to New Guinea. It was in 2004, and the skeleton people, they're representing their ancestors. So they're in custom costume and paint to celebrate their ancestry, the death of their ancestors, and to perform in what's called a sing sing, which in New Guinea is a kind of a show. It's like a singing and dancing of custom show, and I photographed them behind the venue that they were performing in. So I actually had a studio built. It's like an outdoor studio that I had built some days before. So I really prepped it and invited people to sit for portraits. And then I made a series of these photographs before they would go out and perform, or when they came, back from performing. And this was one group.
It's a little bit like a kind of PNG version of the sort of Mexican Day of the Dead.
It very much so. It's funny you say that, because I was editing some pictures from Day of the Dead yesterday, I think it was, and it does have a sort of a connection. Death has been a big thing for me in terms of my theme. I've got an ongoing theme that I look at the kind of rituals around death, I suppose.
Yeah, that seems very evident in your work, and I'd love to know. It's an interesting thing to be talking about while joyful and very lively sounds of a birthday party are leaking through behind you.
I apologize, but it's my daughter's. She's 13 today, so I did have a little sing with her earlier, but some family are downstairs, but it's all good. Yeah, I'll go and get some cake later.
Well, look, we will not keep you from the party any longer. Thank you very much for being my guest today and for sharing some of your extraordinary work. I know that you do also give talks, and I think that we're probably going to tap you on the shoulder when Clifton reopens and see whether we can persuade you to come and give a talk at Clifton. We would really, really love to have you.
Yeah, if I'm showing the work and talking about the work in question, it's a good thing to do, and that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, well, we'd love to have you back. And to everybody, thank you very much for watching.
Thank you.
In such numbers. This will also be posted onto Facebook and be shareable through the website at a later date. This is actually our final Clifton conversation in the first series. We're going to take a short break, and then we will be back in a few weeks' time to celebrate some more local talent. And in the meantime, stay warm, stay safe, wash your hands, wear a mask.